I'm Bronwyn Williams, a facilitator and commentator on bias and diversity. And this is a series called Bringing Bias in from the Cold. Today, my conversation partner is David Neal. Welcome, David.
How are we going, Bron?
Doing really, really well. David, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a co-director of a company called the Eighth Mile Consulting. My background spreads out across a military leadership experience for 14 years. I was ultimately medically transferred out, and then I moved into the corporate world where I moved into project management as my primary field of expertise. And then later on, I would go in to create the company with my good friend and business partner, Jonathan Clark. And we've, I guess, built this company on a mantra of good people helping good people. And we're very selective about who we spend time with and who we associate our energy with. And that's why we enjoy being around people like yourself, because ultimately what we do is we try and improve businesses in a very holistic fashion, everything from project management all the way through to risk management and change, all the way through to leadership and resilience. And we'll build customized packages for companies to actually create a solution to their problem.
Oh, wow. Yes, I can see how you and I fit together, and we have had previous conversations and built out a relationship, which is fantastic. And I'm really pleased that you are able to talk with me today around bias. So let's kick off the conversation by getting your definition of bias. And I always say there's no right and wrong answers.
Sure. Well, I typically approach these sort of questions from a high-performing team lens. My background is I did, national level sports in karate, and then I went into army and then worked into very high-performing teams. So I kind of approach it from that angle. And I would say that everyone goes through life and they experience different things. And when they go through that journey, they start picking up patterns, and they start picking up information that they formulate into what they understand to be true. Over time, that becomes very segmented from what another person's experience or another culture's experience may be. And we eventually get to a long way down that journey, and one could safely say that we don't know what we don't know. My experiences have gone so far divergent to someone else's that what I think to be true and right is actually very disaggregated from what someone else's would be. And so my understanding of bias is knowing what those precursors were that led to what my understanding of what true is, and cross-referencing off another person's individual and averaging it out to figure out what the closest thing to true really is. That's kind of the way I approach it.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I want to pick up on 2 points. The first one is about patterns. We love to see the patterns, don't we? I use the phrase connect the dots, and we look back over our lives and we try to connect the dots because we're trying to make sense of what has happened to us, and then draw some truth out of that for ourselves that we can live by. So given your experiences, which are very different to mine, and I've lived longer than you, so I've got more experiences and more patterns to draw on, what do you see from your own life are some of the patterns that you have found that you then base truth on?
Sure. I like to think about it in terms of the patterns would be where I've invested my time. So, the people you hang around will undoubtedly have a rub-off effect on you, and that will mark your understanding of the world. And I think it's a really important point to bring out the distinction between values and beliefs, because I think beliefs naturally transcribe to our bias. But in recent years, I've had very strong mentors instill an idea that values are far more powerful and a means of building collaboration and rapport and trust, because beliefs can and do change over time, but values largely stay true throughout the duration of our lives. We often get them from our family or, our cultural groups. So to answer your question, I would say my beliefs have changed in terms of patterns because I've hung around different groups, very, very different from each other. And suddenly my beliefs will switch and I'll go, geez, I never thought about it like that. But my values have always remained the same. And, you can actually see a couple of them behind you. I've got service, initiative, and I've got accountability and integrity. And so the patterns I've found that have led to those values seem true for all the groups that I've been around, if that makes sense. My beliefs have changed fundamentally throughout the course of my life.
I found it very interesting as you were making that distinction between beliefs and values, because that gave me some words for an experience of my own, which was when I was on Nauru working with the Salvation Army and asylum seekers. That was where I was first confronted with my biases around racism and white superiority. But what I could see, started to see those things in myself, and they did not align with how I saw myself, because I didn't see myself as racist or really wanted to be somebody who showed superiority. So now I can see, it's just good. Other people give you the words sometimes to make sense of things. My beliefs were the things that had come through to me through childhood and growing up in a largely white monocultural area of Sydney. There were these beliefs around fear of the other, of those who are different to us, and that, white people were superior, they knew best. So they were the beliefs. But my values were that we were all the same, that we were good, that everybody was worthy. So actually my experience on Nauru brought those two things into sharp relief. So my beliefs were over here, and I actually saw them. And then I thought, but they're not my values. And that was actually such an eye-opener. It was a bit
very
appalling at the time. It was a bit like a body blow when I realised the two didn't match up, but then I could change my beliefs. So I really thank you for that distinction, because I do think we tend to conflate the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say from my own perspective, I'm a director on a charity called Trojan's Trek that deals with servicemen and women, military predominantly, but also ex-emergency service personnel who have pretty significant mental injuries, and in some cases are right down the other end of the spectrum. And one of the defining features for people that have experienced mental injuries as a result of their service are what we call moral injuries, in so far that they've done something that's gone against their values. And so we subscribe to an idea that people are not their behaviors. You can't, you can at a legal level judge someone on their behaviors, and rightfully we should, because there should be cause and consequence. But at a personal level, people are not their behaviors. They will do erratic and irrational things based on their beliefs at the time.
Yes.
They might believe that that's the right thing to do, but it crosses the line of their values. And they'll look back on that and they will look at it with regret and resentment.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I love that example, because that was what I was wanting to talk with you about next, was about experiences around bias from whatever viewpoint that you're coming at it. So thank you for that. And I like the idea of that you call what we would say a mental health issue, a mental injury. And I think that's a really clear distinction as well, because people are injured mentally. So apart from your work with Trojan Trekkers, is that right?
Yeah, we just call them trekkers, yeah.
Yeah, that you've had that sort of you could share around bias and how you've had to manage it for yourself, or you've found it thrust upon you and had to deal with it?
I can give you a really gritty one that proved the point to me about bias and its effects. So when I was 22 years old, I was put into Afghanistan for 10 and a half months, combat operations. I came at it from an angle of, I only had 22 years experience on this planet. My experience was, I was Caucasian, Irish background, but Australian grown. I went to an all guys school. I then joined a predominantly male environment. I then deployed on this operation. And so I found it very, very difficult to find a means in order to find rapport with the local populace, both so the civilians, the Afghan army, and at times the Taliban themselves. And, Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense through the Vietnam War and through the Cuban Missile Crisis, a very, very intelligent man. In fact, one of the smartest men of the century, gave two key points. And one was empathize with your enemy. And he was referring to the relationship between Khrushchev and Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he also said, rationality alone will not save us. And so these two themes, I was trying to empathize with my enemy, but I found it very, very difficult because we came at it from such different lenses. Yes. So difficult to find common ground, even in an understanding of your enemy at that time, because different expectations on religion, a different source religion, a different understanding of country in and of itself. They don't understand of an Afghanistan as a country, whereas in the Western nation, we identify as Australians. So when you're talking to an Afghan, you're saying, look, we're trying to build an Afghan nation. And they're like, I don't care. I don't even know what that is. What I care about is my village or my valley or my tribal group. And so the context was just so slewed from one way to the other that it was really, really difficult to find rapport. There was behavioral things we could do to match and mirror and build rapport, but it was all surface level. At a very deep level, it was very difficult to find interpersonal relationships that would stand the test of time, because we were literally coming at it from complete polar opposite perspectives of the world.
Yeah. That's
I would say that was fundamental in the way we planned our operations, the way we talked to people, the whole strategic overlook of the operation itself. The 12 years we've been in Afghanistan has come from a completely biased perspective. Imagine if we could have found better common ground and we knew what those biases were before we went in.
That is huge, isn't it? And kudos to you for trying, for starters, because a lot of people don't even try because they're not even aware that they should. They've got their own way of thinking. And I think biases are a bit like blinkers sometimes. They keep us focused in one direction, which can be helpful, but oftentimes just doesn't allow us to see so much more that we could. So to be able to at least, in a sense there, you were becoming aware of your biases. And I say that, awareness is more than 50% of the game. It's when we're unaware and we are unwilling then to even consider that we might have biases. That's when the danger happens.
Absolutely. You've absolutely nailed it. It's, I mentioned it before, you don't know what you don't know. And it speaks to an importance, and we put huge amounts of time into educating people on the importance of objectivity. And it works on a premise that, under a beautiful, glossy world consensus, there is the idea of a truth. There is truths in this world. And if we have a number of different approaches and we average them out, we'll get something that's closer to that truth. And I would argue that you never quite get to truth. It's like nirvana. You'll never quite get there. You get very close sometimes, and data is a great way to do it. But then I would put on to that, data is only as good as the questions you ask, and the questions you ask need to be cross-referenced against other people, because they'll ask different questions in different ways and you'll get very different responses. So data is only as good as the baseline questions that kicked it into gear in the first place. So in the search for truth, the understanding of bias is so important. And, you know, in our team, the way we've tried to address it is by hiring people with fundamentally different approaches to our own. And in doing so, we feel that that's the closest way we can get to diversification of our team, but not from a, you know, a soft wishy-washy perspective, but from a high performing functioning perspective. It makes our team more effective. I'll give you, do you want a really good example of this?
I'd love
Ron?
one. Yes, please.
All right. So the other day we were coming up and we were developing a lot of our content for our course. And one of the acronyms had 5 letters that we wanted to turn into a word. It was TAMES, right? Simple task. We're like, oh, we could, you know, someone's like, oh, it's Tames. And then, you know, I've thrown in, oh, it's mates, you know, it's Australian spin on it. And then we had solidified it. We'd created the content. We'd moved on. And the whole course module at about that point was about forming and building teams. Teams was
oh gosh, yes.
So my wife's just walking past and she's just like, why don't you just use teams? I was like, again, right? Our bias and our own slew pulled us into different directions. And the obvious answer was right there. It was it was someone who wasn't so involved in the problem that had a different perspective that came up with a far better solution. And as it is, it's locked in as mates. I can't change it now. We'll do it for future iterations. But the point was proven, I think, in that particular example. Very, very simple example.
Yeah, look, that is excellent. And I love the fact that you were open to that. And I know she's your wife, and so therefore I would hope you were open to her ideas. But I think that's one of the things about understanding that we are biased and that we have biases, because when we're able to do that, there's a sense in which we no longer feel we have to, you know, we must protect our positions. Once we become aware that we've got biases, we then actually open ourselves up, and we don't have this defensiveness any longer, or our defensiveness is less anyway about, you know, protecting our position at all costs, because we're actually open to other people's ideas and perspectives.
Very well said. And you would be, you know, you've got your finger on the pulse with a lot of the content that we push out. But there are 2 themes we always push out. One is leadership is not about you. And the second is leave your ego at the door.
Oh, gosh,
and
yes.
for those leaders and those organizations that can pull that off or even get close to it, they absolutely pull away from the pack. And in 2010, there was the British cycling team adopted a new principle called the aggregation of marginal gains. And it spoke to the collective result of 1% increments of improvement across the broad spectrum of one's existence. And so from a professional sporting perspective, it included, you know, washing your hands twice. So you didn't get sick 1 day less a year, which was 365th improvement on training days, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, testing the bike for aerodynamics, making sure our posture was right when we were in rest periods to isolate certain muscle groups, et cetera, et cetera. But it took someone to come at it from a very different perspective to pull the British cycling team into a trophy-winning spot. They ended up with gold within a number of years, and they held the position quite conclusively because of this response. Linking the 2 together, I would say that bias and understanding that your own perspective on this earth gets you to a certain point. You've got a certain level of knowledge, of experience, and of ideas, and you can be open to new ideas, but essentially it's capped. There is a finite amount of neurons in our brain that allow us to have X amount of memories at any one time. So as a system, we're locked down at some point. We hit that tolerance. By bringing in totally different people with different systems and different experiences, that idea of the aggregation of marginal gains, that 1% improvement on high performing teams, and leveraging off the true power of diversity controlled by very, very controlled leadership and very, very deliberate actions from a leadership perspective, bring it all together to develop like record breakers, the ones that are the top 1% in the world. And they're the ones that are fighting their bias to get ahead of the pack.
Yeah, look, that's a great analogy and idea there about managing incremental change, because all change is just a little bit by little bit. So as we bring our conversation to a close, David, is there one wonderful thought that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Sure. I'd say, referencing back to my point about leaving your ego at the door, I'd like to plant a seed that there is a whole world of truth that you don't know yet. And many of the things that you believe to be true right now, at this exact moment, are categorically wrong. You don't necessarily know what they are. And if you're willing to leave the emotion out of it, and you're willing to get clinical about it, and you genuinely want to know what is true in this world, then you've got a rare opportunity to realign and open the idea that new information might lead you to a different conclusion.
That is a wonderful way to end our conversation. So thank you very much, David Neal. And I'm Bronwyn Williams, and this is Bringing Bias in from the Cold.